Hello everyone and welcome to today's Geobites presentation on the Geopolitics of Video Games. My name's Emma and I'm one of the Widening Participation Officers at the university, and today I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Bos, one of our senior lecturers in Human Geography, who will be running today's Geobites presentation. Hello Dr. Bos.
Hi there.
You'll see him shortly, and I'm also joined by my colleague Isabel, who'll be moderating the questions as they come in. Hello Isabel.
Hi Emma.
Brilliant. I will shortly be handing over to Dr. Daniel Bos for the presentation, and during the presentation you'll be given the opportunity to ask questions using the chat function on the right hand side of your screen. Your audio and video won't be shared, but you can ask questions anonymously if you wish. You just have to have ticked the box to indicate that you wish to be anonymous. You can like other people's questions that people may have asked by indicating your interest also. Isabel will collate any questions and ask Dr. Bos these at the end of the session. Okay, I think we're ready to start. So over to you, Dr. Daniel Bos.
Hi all, thanks Emma for that introduction. Yes, so I'm a human geographer with interest in political geography. And basically the focus of this presentation is exploring the relationship between popular culture and world politics. And so, as you can see from the image, I'm interested in video games and in particular military-themed video games. So I'm sure a few of you might be familiar with these types of games, despite the age rating of them, or at least have heard about them or seen them advertised. So in this talk, what I want to do is go beyond this rhetoric that they're just a game, to show how these games both reflect and shape popular understandings of geopolitics, and then to also consider what's at stake when military violence is turned into pleasurable consumption. So for those of you who are familiar with these types of games, these military-themed video games often put you in the perspective of a soldier, usually US or UK special forces, and the narratives of the game are driven often by various geopolitical events and issues. And we can see, for example, the role of historical narratives, which are produced in Call of Duty World War II, for example, and more recently the Cold War, so drawing on historical events here. We can also see the ways in which commercial video games, military video games, look at futuristic scenarios and think about future threats, geopolitical threats, and the rise of technology. And also we can think about how games often reflect and mirror contemporary events and issues. And these games that focus on more contemporary events is something that I've been interested in my research. So the description of the games are very geopolitical, I would argue. But I think it's also important to mention another side of military-themed video games. So these video games that are being developed by military and funded by the state. So this example here, America's Army, is a bit different. It's not necessarily created by commercial industries. It's been developed and funded by the US military. So it's been specifically used as a recruitment tool to encourage people to sign up to the military, but also as a training tool. So the content is modified to train new recruits about military procedures, such as the chain of command and the rules of engagement. Now, this game has been made freely available. It was released in 2003, I think, and have had millions of players engage with the game. And it really shows this close relationship between the military and the video game industry, which I'll outline a bit later on. As I say, my research interests have been mainly around the commercial video game sector, and in particular the Call of Duty titles. So again, this is a hugely popular video game, and one of the main reasons it is my interest is because of this popularity. So you can see here from the sale figures as of October 2019, the Call of Duty franchise has sold nearly 250 million copies. So this is surpassing the sales of other forms of popular culture, your Hollywood blockbuster films, for examples. And we can see particular games such as the Modern Warfare 3 series, another game that I was very interested in my research, sold over $1 billion in total sales within its first 16 days. Again, it just shows the extent and size of this industry and the global reach and popularity military-themed video games have, and the importance why we take them seriously and why we should be interested in them. And yet, this is often how video games are understood by the public and academics alike. They're simply seen as purely frivolous entertainment played by solitary teenagers in their rooms, and whereas this academic suggests, you don't learn anything about the world from engaging with games. So, however, as I'm arguing here, they are important because of the way they script the world. They divide the world into often goodies and baddies, are important in shaping our geographical imaginations, our understandings of place, space, and identity. It is through really video games and popular culture more generally which we come to understand how people and places are framed and understood, and these places that we may not visited or people we have not met. So it's important in terms of shaping our geographical imagination of the world. Furthermore, we can see the broader significance of military video games and how they interact with world politics. I mean, here's a few stories from the press that show how people and places, how they are framed is not innocent but deeply political in these video games. So here you can see a story about the late former Cuban leader Fidel Castro, who was assassinated, or at least his body double was assassinated in the Call of Duty Black Ops series. And this caused diplomatic outrage from Cuba, who cited this was the glorification of the actions of the US and the previous attempts by the US to actually assassinate Castro as well. So games have also been charged with rewriting history, in this case drawing on previous controversial real-life events in ways of blaming others, in this case Russia, and blamed for, in this case, the highway of death during the First Gulf War, which actually involved the US-led coalition at the time. So again, this way in which games can rewrite historical events and issues. Go back. Finally, we can see how such video games have been put to use by non-state actors. So in this case, the terrorist group ISIS have selectively used imagery and clips from games for propaganda purpose and as a means of recruiting young people. So in other words, if it's just a game and it doesn't matter to geopolitics, then people are going into a lot of trouble in contesting them and engaging with them for nothing. So this is an area which myself and a colleague have written about, the role of popular geopolitics. Now, I'm sure some of you will be exploring geopolitics at college in your geography A-levels, for example, and focusing really, I can imagine, on the geopolitics of resources, about the geopolitics of conflict, for example, very much focusing on these geographical factors and how they influence and inform global politics and international relations. So really, geopolitics is this quite seductive term. It seems to help us describe what's going on in the world and explain relationships between different states and then prescribe action, what needs to be done. Now, as myself and a colleague have argued, it's important to consider the role of popular culture in the media. This focus on popular geopolitics shifts the focus very much from the state to instead understanding the role of culture in shaping and framing everyday geopolitical understandings. So instead of the political elites or statespersons, it turns to the role of everyday life and everyday people to understand how geopolitical knowledge circulates and what impact this has. So in this book, we focus on a range of popular cultural and media items, including social media, magazines, television, newspapers. All these provide geopolitical representations which figure an impact on our everyday life. So in other words, the media and popular culture shape, we argue that the media and popular culture shapes responses to political decisions and events by publics, but also shape how political figure forces them to respond to and produce real life events. So it's this relationship between the popular culture and geopolitics that we're very much interested in. Now, what I want to do now is just go through a bit more detail and draw out some examples about the geopolitics of military video games, in particular focusing on the Call of Duty series, which again has been a key focus of my research. So as we've discussed, military-themed video games play an important role in scripting our understanding of global politics. They often divide the world into simple categories, such as goodies and baddies. So I really like this map here, despite it being a bit dated now, but it shows you who are often the villains or the bad guys in the geopolitical narratives of games and military games since the year 2000s. So as these games are often produced by companies in the US, we can see their influence, and it offers a good opportunity to see how the US sees itself in relation to the rest of the world. So from this map, we can see fears of, for example, in Latin America, drawing on historical tensions. We can think about the war on drugs, but also the Cold War. And we see these Cold War anxieties still linger and produced and performed in these games. We see, for example, Cuba and Russia figuring as the enemies in these games. But then we can also see the emerging threats, such as China and North Korea as well. What's also been interesting is the growing interest in the Middle East region, and this can be attributed to historical events such as the Gulf Wars, but also more recently the War on Terror emerging after 2001, post 9/11. Now, one of the games I've been interested in exploring and analysing is the Call of Duty Modern Warfare series, which came out or began in 2007. And this really brought to focus the Middle East as a key site of intrigue and conflict within the military video game narrative. So I suggested popular geopolitics is really interested in how people and places are framed and the impact of this framing. So they can produce and reinforce notions of otherness and script responses to particular people, places and events. So a continual focus on the Middle Eastern locations in video games presents it often as simply as a site of never-ending or perpetual conflict. So if you can see from the image, the locations in the Middle East are often war-torn environments. They are also usually absent of civilians, so presenting such places as simply terrorist havens requiring military intervention. So as the character dialogue suggests here from some of the gameplay, the Middle East is presented and understood as the Wild West, demanding control and military interventions. The ways people from the Middle East are depicted in the games are often drawn on stereotypical Oriental tropes, which present them as often barbaric, uncivilized and backwards. Now, this is important but to note that it's not just found in video games, these Oriental tropes, but in other popular cultural forms as well, such as film, which tend to perpetuate such stereotypes and representations of the East and the people in the East as well. So the late scholar Edward Said once wrote and termed this Orientalism, the ways in which the West writes and represents the East as an exotic other. So which at the time has been used in service of imperial power. But as we look at popular culture today, these ideas still are important and resonate within popular culture. Now, what's also interesting is to I suppose, flip things around, and the focus, the perspective is often very different for how the West is portrayed. And as I said before, usually these video games focus on the US, UK special forces, and their characters are often very individualized, heroic, hyper-masculinized, and both very different to the enemies in these games in their appearance and attitudes. So their actions are often seen as just, rational, and are painted in stark contrast, in this case, with the other. So video games therefore can work to produce and reinforce notions of otherness and script responses to the way particular people, places and events are understood. Therefore, it's really important to consider these narratives and representations of the world and the impact they have. So what I want to go on to now, we've thought about the representations. I'm going to consider how these games are made and how these geopolitical narratives get made. Who's doing these? Who's creating these? Where do these ideas come from? As mentioned earlier, it is important to know that what has been dubbed the military industrial entertainment complex, or the military entertainment complex for short. So this term identifies these entanglements of the military and how it invades our everyday life in subtle and not so subtle ways. So this can include, for example, technologies such as GPS and the internet, everyday technologies which emerge from military funding and research, to even other more banal everyday items such as food and fashion. So video games are no exception to this and have had a long history, and what I suggest here is symbiotic relationship with the military. So to put simply, the military use video games for recruitment and training, and the video game companies themselves to support video game companies, whilst the entertainment industries use the military to help make the games as realistic as possible. So the relationship between the video game industry and the military becomes mutually beneficial. So coming back to our example of the Call of Duty series, we can see this as they have hired military advisors. In this case, as you can see from the image here, retired Lieutenant Colonel Hank Kersey. So he helps in the development of the games. So this oversight can be seen in a variety of ways, but it comes right down to the smallest of details. So in this case, as the quote suggests, how characters speak over walkie-talkies. The Hank Kersey here suggests in the early days, I always noticed dialogue that was sounding off. Soldiers would use Roger over out, Wilco, which means I will comply. These are sacred words that are used by military forces, so we really wanted them to be in there correctly. As you can see, the below image to that, they also assist in the CGI aspect of the game, in an attempt to make sure the movement of the soldiers when in action is represented and performed accurately. So from the perspective of the military advisor, this is very much seen as a positive to the military's image. As Hank Kersey goes on to say here, they're a tribute to the guys that are doing this for real. Such games therefore attempt to present a favourable perspective of the military, overlooking or glorifying the violence and death which comes with the realities of war. So the pleasures of playing war, therefore, comes at the expense of critical reflection of how geopolitics and military violence is framed and understood. So whilst the video game industry benefits from the input of military advisors in producing these more realistic video games that they can sell, the video game companies can also benefit the military. We can see this in a number of ways with the Call of Duty series. For example, here, the Call of Duty franchise has set up its own charity to support the US and later UK military veterans finding work after their service. So they often sell download packs and put on charitable events to raise money to go towards this. We also have seen how video game producers have entered the political domain as well. So former director of Call of Duty Black Ops 1 and 2 in 2014 was approached by a political think tank, the Atlantic Council. So they wanted him to come on board as someone with creative input, to consider a role that focuses on what future threats the US and its allies face and how they might overcome them through the use of different military technologies and actions. So here we can see who and how video games are being developed and what impact this has for how games frame military violence and how the video game industry is impacting on real-world political issues and events. What I want to focus on now is just also thinking, we've looked at the representations, the productions. What is curiously often absent when we research or look into video games is the players themselves. And we often see news stories which focus on video games and how they instill violence. And this again is perpetuated often in academic research. So it's very much looking at connections between individuals and violence. So what I've looked in my research, and I'll explore further in a moment, is looking at how individuals actually engage with the geopolitics of games. You know, they're often regarded as passive, disinterested in the geopolitics of video games, and simply dupes to the engaging with the content here. So what I'm interested in play, or what has been termed ludic geopolitics, and this presents new insights to understandings, how popular geopolitical understandings get made. It helps us focus on the ways in which audiences actually interact. What do they take away from engaging with popular culture more generally? Rather than just focusing on the cultural the producer's message, have a look at the agency and interpretations of audiences. This also raises questions about the scale of geopolitics. Again, we go back to geopolitics is not just about the nation states and their interactions, but how that is made possible by on-the-ground individuals engaging, understanding geopolitics. So geopolitical events affect people in everyday life. And what's interesting here is thinking about the setting of the home, domestic setting, where we consume our media and video games, how the home comes to shape our interactions with the geopolitics of playing war. And finally, if we're looking at audiences, it also raises questions of embodiment and play. You know, these games are designed to be fun and interactive and immersive. So how does this sense of effective emotive pull of these games, how do these experiences impact how people understand these video games? So some of my research has actually been going out, doing ethnography, sitting around playing video games, but also interviewing players as well, to try and find out what their viewpoints are when interacting with these geopolitical worlds. And so what's interesting, I've just got a few points, so here's a few quotes from the research I've undertaken. You can see here how individuals connect to contemporary and historical geopolitical events and issues. So Michael, the top quote, suggests how he's interested in seeing how these games pan out, how realistic they are, and how relevant they are to world events. The below comment also points to the historical video games as being really important in educating. So people see that these video games can educate themselves about historical events which happened in the past. I think it's also important to note, some gamers also noted that the representations presented by these games are, as Ali suggests, false. It's a completely false representation of the Middle East because they show you a shanty town like buildings made out of rock and mud and the road completely sand and there's palm trees. So again, there's a bit of pushback here about the representations and how these video games frame people and places. The other key aspect that came out of my research involved the difference between the campaign mode, which is this very, what we've been talking about earlier, about the very geopolitical narrative, against the multiplayer mode, which is arguably one of the most popular things about these video games, that you can interact with others around the world. Interesting, though, that the geopolitics extends into conversations and the social aspects of playing online. So Nick discussed this, which was really interesting when he talks about playing online. A lot of arguments about different cultures appear. So you can think about the clan tags and people who have the former USSR and stuff. And you get people arguing over saying like Russians are better and all that kind of stuff. So again, this geopolitics of the video games and the way that people interact with them on the multiplayer option also presents its own ways in which people demonstrate, perform and engage with geopolitics, which was a really interesting find. The final point that I really found interesting was the experiential and the emotive. Again, these video games are designed to be adrenaline stimulating, designed to be fun. So what impact does that have on players? And again, when we come back to changing or creating military violence for pleasurable consumption, what's at stake there? I think this quote by Alan was really interesting, because it talks about all different aspects of the game. It's not just about the narratives or the landscapes within the game. It's about things such as the weapons. It's about the sounds. It's about the haptic sense when you're with a controller and it shakes, making you feel you are in that location. And again, I think there's a really interesting way when we go right down to the micro scale and think about how these games connect us to particular places, and how they come to inform and shape through our experiences, how geopolitics and military violence can be understood. So I've talked a lot about, I just want to end here, I've talked about the geopolitics of video games in relation to these ones that very much show a positive light to the military. But what I'm interested in also how games are being promoted for geopolitical change. So popular culture and video games in particular have the power to challenge and disrupt geopolitical power. So video games can become sites of protest. Here we can see an image of Joseph DeLapp, an American artist, who chose the American Army video game that I introduced earlier to protest the US war on terror. And he did this by typing the names of soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, presenting this online memorial. Ways in which video games can challenge geopolitical power is how they can be modified and customized by the players. I'm thinking about how protests are organised in areas such as Second Life. You can see how players can create their own signs, for example, in this case the peace sign. But there's also games that are purposely developed to promote social, political and environmental change. So such games, I would suggest, offer this anti-geopolitical eye. In other words, they offer an alternative vision of conflict and violence, drawing attention to perspectives which are often overlooked. So there's several games which are beginning to do this, and you might be interested in following up in these after this session. But Unmanned is a simple game that is available online. Is a game which I often get my students to play, as it looks as an alternative perspective to games such as Call of Duty. So in Unmanned, you adopt the perspective as a drone pilot rather than just shooting aimlessly. The player has to make a number of decisions and reflect on the choices they make. So moreover, the game points to issues of warfare at a distance when we talk about drones and people killed by these drone strikes, but also acknowledging the high rates of post-traumatic stress disorders which drone pilots experience. Which is interesting, this war of mine, and I think this goes back to an earlier point, absent in many of these video games are civilians and the perspective of civilians. So this war of mine, players take control of civilians who are trying to survive an urban conflict. So this game has gained more widespread critical acclaim and draws on first-hand accounts of conflicts such as the Bosnian War. So by using gameplay to promote moral and ethical decisions from the player, such games encourage to think about the consequences of war and conflict rather than just simply glamorizing it. The potential of games to offer social and political change has not gone unnoticed. As you can see, organisations such as the United Nations and the Refugee Agency within that have been turning to games as a means of communicating and educating on the wider geopolitical and humanitarian issues. So here you can see the senior public information officer who really suggests the importance of these games in educating and adopting a different perspective to focus on issues such as migrations and also the difficulties that refugees face. Okay, so that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening, but hopefully I've given you an insight into some of the things that we teach in the geography department, and hopefully got you interested in seeing a different perspective to understanding geopolitics, focusing on the role of popular culture, and in particular video games and how they inform and shape our actions and our actions, but also government actions as well, and are important when we talk about geopolitics. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Bos. That was so interesting. I'm just going to check with Isabel to see if we've got any questions that have come through. Isabel?
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions, and we've got more coming in as well. So we'll start. Two of them are actually linked. So we were asked, would you describe some of these games as US propaganda, particularly because the US has the resources to make the games and not all countries do?
Yeah, great question. I think this comes back to the America's Army game. So that certainly lends itself to this form of propaganda. It's a game created to instill or to show or promote the US military. I think what's really interesting with this game, they hand it out, or they have handed it out in the past at sporting events, for example. Other interesting things to think about in this game is that the age rating for this, I think, is you can play if you're over 13. So they held back from putting lots of blood and gore in it to allow younger people to be able to connect with these games. And you know, I think it's really important to, as I suggest, show how they're trying to create these games in a way that reflect military commands, chain of commands, rule of engagement, and so very much coming from the American Army perspective in that regard. So yeah, really good question.
Okay, so following on from that, then we're asked, do many other countries, recognising that the US perhaps dominates the market and the narratives, make similar games to popular consumption military themed? And if they do, who do they then place as the enemy in those games?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another really interesting question. As I said, most of my research has been focusing on the US example. You know, there are games out there, but arguably the most popular commercial video game sector is coming from the US and especially California. This is where a lot of these video games are produced and engaged with. There are certainly other games there that are bringing out different perspectives. You'll have to forgive me, I've forgotten the name off the top of my head, but there is a video game, for example, that shows Israel have produced video games from their perspective, but also Palestinians as well have produced video games to show from their perspective as well. So there are video games out there. The US market really dominates it at the moment. As I say, with the last points, we're starting to see, I suppose, with ease of technology, shall we say, and less resources required, that people are able to create their own games, and we can see more and more of these smaller video game companies coming out. So this War of Mine, for example, developed by a Polish video game company as well. So things are starting to shift within the bigger video game industry.
Cool. So then, quite earlier we were asked, do you think that using real warfare scenarios for entertainment is morally justified if it's educational?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think this comes back to some of the points I made. So a lot of the criticisms about how war is presented in this. You know, it's often glorified, it's sanitized, it's often presented as surgical. You kill someone, the body disappears. So the realities warfare are missing from that, and it's presenting a very narrow focus of what conflict looks like. And so that is, I think, really quite problematic when you're turning that into pleasurable consumption. I think the other aspect of that, there are companies out there that are trying to present more realistic by, for example, making players follow the rules of engagement, making players follow international humanitarian laws as well during conflict. Yeah, possibly that's going in the right direction. I think it just speaks to a more broader questions around, as I say, what happens when we turn to military violence into just forms of entertainment, and should we as a society be questioning the role of warfare of the military as well?
Yeah, because someone's then, you obviously said the US use military games for training and have done it on purpose, and someone's then said, don't the UK do that as well? And if they do, therefore, don't they have to be accurate? Which obviously feeds into what you've just said about actual rules of engagement and warfare. But do the UK do the same, or is it only in the US? I mean, obviously your research is in the US, but...
I mean, there have been, so the British military do use video games. I have done in the past, but they don't have necessarily the resources as the US military. You know, the US military is the most spent billions, if not trillions, on its military over the last how many years. The British Army doesn't have that financial backing behind it. I think what's interesting more generally is the advertisements that have recently come out where they're pinpointing or targeting gamers. So there was recently a focus on the next generation of combatants, a series of advertisements targeting binge gamers. And they see that these skills developed online can be transferable into the military. Again, how transferable they are is very questionable.
Cool. So there's one last question which then says, and I think it's quite interesting, you talked about games for change, and obviously a lot's been around the military, but are there any games for change which don't just focus on the aspects of war? So you sort of mentioned some. Are there any others, do you think, that...
Yeah, so I'm aware this talk, for some of you who was around sustainability or climate change or suggested that. I think that came as a bit of an error, but there are games out there which are focusing more broadly on things such as climate change. So the Games for Change movement, again, you can go after this, look on their website, have hundreds of games which people have developed which look at issues such as climate change, look at economic exploitation, for example, look at migration. So again, there's these companies out there which are using video games to generate, educate about various issues that are beyond military violence and war and conflict as well. So if this is something of interest, I'd really urge you to have a look at that website. The other element of this as well is that journalists have used video games in the past and continue to do so, which to keep up with contemporary events. So again, something's happened in the news, people have used video games to communicate. And I think this is really interesting. It's a very unique form, video games, because you have to, it requires your own interaction, and you have to engage with the rules and mechanics of the video games as well. So they're very, they can be a good tool in exploring lots of different possibilities and in communicating about systems, issues around economies, issues around climate change. So there's a lot going on now, I think, which is taking us forward.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And I think we've covered all the questions we've got today. So that's really good. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Isabel, and thank you, Dr. Bos. We hope you've enjoyed the session and found it really useful, and we look forward to your attendance at our next event. If there's anything else we can help you with, please take a look at our outreach pages, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. We do have a lot of links to previous talks as well in the chat, so if you do want to have a look at any of them, please just click on. But thank you for now, and thank you for attending. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.